Hello, students, and welcome to the lecture on populations, section 5.1 and 5.2. There's no Google Doc or Google Form handout for this, so we're just doing this old school, so you're going to need to get out some pencil and paper, and then this is what you will turn in. You'll take a picture of this and submit this on Schoology. So, Chapter 5, Populations. As always, when you take these notes, follow the pattern that the notes are presented in the slideshow. For instance, if there appears to be an indent, or if a line gets skipped, if words are underlined or boxed in, follow that same pattern. By organizing your notes in this way, it organizes your notes and the ideas and the concepts on the paper, and by extension, that organizes that information in your brain. All right, so here we go. Chapter 5, Populations. Big idea. So start by, literally just write down big idea, colon, and then this is our big idea. Due to the interdependence in nature, many factors contribute to changes in population. We're going to look at 5 metrics or 5 ways that we describe and measure populations, and we'll consider changes in those populations. These are a couple of interesting pictures. This is a Christmas Island in Micronesia. So these are crabs that live up in the mountain, and every year, by some biological feat of timing that is not at all yet understood, all of these crabs migrate down out of the mountains and make their way to the beaches for mating. They mate, and then they lay their eggs in the sand, and then all of those crabs crawl all the way back up to the mountains. As you can see, it's a huge tourist attraction. People come from all over the world to see the crabs on Christmas Island. Sometimes they literally have to close the roads because these are a protected species. This is just a really good example of how a population of crab or a population of animals can have a huge impact on a culture. All right, so due to the interdependence in nature, many factors contribute to changes in populations. All right, so Section 5.1, how populations grow. We describe populations really with 5 characteristics. So we're going to talk about 5 main characteristics that we use to describe populations. And the first one is geographic range. Now, the range is how large of an area a population occupies. Now remember, our definition of a population: members of the same species living in the same place at the same time. A good example here in Minnesota, we have a strong culture in Minnesota with deer hunting season. So every year, millions of Minnesotans are concerned about the size of the deer population and the distribution of the deer population in Minnesota. How crowded is the population, and really where are they living? Right, so the geographic range, an area inhabited by a population. Now these ranges can be huge, and they can be also very tiny. So I have a couple of just examples, right? The mold on a loaf of bread. That's a population of mold, and their range is however much space they're occupying on that piece of bread, versus, say, cod in the North Atlantic Ocean, which would cover thousands and thousands of square miles. Speaking of the white-tailed deer, this is a map of the geographic range of white-tailed deer in North America. As you can see, they go as far south as Mexico and Florida, as far north as northern Canada, and all the way up into the Yukon Territory in Canada. So first characteristic, the range, the geographic range that they occupy. Density. So this is number of individuals per unit area. Essentially, how crowded is the population? Now you can have a population that has a large range that is not very dense, or a large range that is very dense. You could have a small range that's very dense. You could have a small range that isn't very dense, and everything in between. So geographic range describes how much space they take up overall, and density describes how crowded it is. Now again, within the same ecosystem, among different populations, the density can vary tremendously. Again, think of a plot of land, maybe that you hunt at, or where your cabin is. The number of oaks in a square mile of land versus the number of beetles in that square mile. There's going to be way fewer oaks, so they might not be nearly as dense as there are beetles. So again, because of the size difference between these two kinds of organisms, those numbers can vary widely. All right, so geographic range and density. Here's just a graphic of some locusts. So this is a locust swarm. So these are basically, they're like grasshoppers on steroids. They used to be found in the United States, but they were driven into extinction in the 1800s. But they're still found in other parts of the world. And these swarms of locusts can number in literally the millions. And as you can see, it's very dense. And as they fly, they can destroy and devour thousands of acres of crops. Distribution. So how spread out are they? Or it's not how crowded they are or their range, but how do they distribute themselves within their population? And there are three main ways. So most populations follow variations of these three patterns. So this one, and this one, these are labeled random. So this is just random. As you can see, these flowers are somewhat random on this mountainside. Here we have some Gentoo penguins that have uniformly spaced themselves apart. And I'll get myself out of the way here. And then here we have, looks like an anchovy ball of some fish that are clumped up. I do want you to pause the notes here for just a moment. You don't have to draw these pictures, but I do want you to draw this little square, like draw a little square and randomly put in some dots and label that as random. Draw one that has more even distribution and label that uniform, and draw one that has these clumped like this. So again, go ahead and pause and draw these three squares with these appropriate labels. All right, so far we've covered three of our five ways that we describe populations: range, density, distribution. The next one, this one's probably one that students struggle with the most. It's the most abstract, and this is the age structure. So how old are the males and the females in the population? What's the age distribution of the population? And this is meaningful when you consider reproduction. Let's take a couple of examples. If we consider, say, the population of, the United States, people in the United States, in all the major age brackets, like 0 to 10, 11 to 20, 21 to 30, right, 31 to 40, etc., the number of individuals in each of those age groups is about the same. And what that means is that typically means you're going to have like steady to slow population growth. Other populations are very bottom heavy, meaning that there's lots and lots of people in, say, the 10 to 20-year-old group or from the 20 to 30-year-old group versus people that are in the older groups. So if your population is bottom heavy, meaning that a huge or disproportionate size of your population is younger, that usually means that population is going to grow faster because those large number of individuals are coming into their reproductive years. If your population is top heavy, meaning a disproportionate amount of the population is older, that usually means that the population is going to be level or even go down because you have a large portion of your population that is well outside of their reproductive years. The same concept also applies to things like fish and deer, etc. A really good example is right now, so it's 2020, right now the DNR and others are concerned about the Lake Mille Lacs, one of the big 5 lakes in Minnesota, and the size of the population of walleye in that lake. For several years, the size of the walleye population has been declining, has been going down, and that's having a huge impact on that lake and all the industry that is surrounded with the fishing on that lake. Well, there's a particular class of fish, and by class I mean like a year. I think at this point it's a group that's 3 or 4 years old that are supposed to be in a particular size. So there's a really narrow slot limit on that lake right now, and there's a strict limit to the number of fish that you can take out, unless that's recently changed. Anyways, the point is that there's this group of fish that's coming into their strong reproductive years, and they want to make that group of fish, that population, really, really large. So if they can keep that population, their numbers really high, then those high numbers will have lots of babies, and that will bring the population back up. So age structure, what are the ages of the males and females? That's important when you consider reproduction, which leads directly to our fifth and most important characteristic of all, and that is our size of the population and the population growth rate. By far and away, this is the number one, the most important characteristic that ecologists, biologists, DNR officers are concerned about when it comes to population. A, what's the size? B, is the population getting bigger? Is the population getting smaller? And how fast is that happening? So is the population stable, growing, shrinking, and how fast or slow? Major considerations when it comes to population. There are 4 influences on growth rate. First 2 are pretty obvious, births and deaths, right? Births add to the population, deaths take away. And then the other 2 are immigration and emigration. Immigration is individuals moving into a population, hence the term immigrant. Emigration is individuals moving out of a population. So you do have within animal populations, you will have individuals that will immigrate or emigrate out, depending upon the individual and the conditions in which that population finds itself. Now again, if I'm going too fast, take the time to pause and make sure you get all these things written down. And again, follow this pattern. I've got a big space here, so skip a line. I've indented here and itemized these things with little hash marks. Take a second and do that. All right, so I do want you to take a second and draw this graphic. You don't have to draw the little tiny fish or this, but I do want you to just make a square and put in a few fish, 3 or 4 or 5 fish. They don't have to be anything fancy. And then just draw in these arrows and label them births and immigration with population increases. And then arrows coming out, and label those deaths and emigration and population decreases. So do take a second, again, pause and illustrate this graphic. Again, you don't have to draw the fish here and on the outsides, but here on the inside. It doesn't have to be fish. Pick the animal of your liking. All right, so 5 characteristics that we use to describe populations: geographic range, geographic density, distribution, age structure, and population growth rate. Those are the 5, and that growth rate is the biggest one. All right, so population growth rate continued. You don't have to write that down. All right, so as a population grows, there are 2 kinds of growth patterns. We explored one already in our introductory reindeer activity. The first one is called exponential growth. So again, this is a lengthy definition. If you need to pause it, please do so you get the complete definition down. Notice how I've numbered it and I've underlined it. Please do that. Again, that keeps the information organized in your brain. All right, so what is exponential growth? It's this idea that the larger a population gets, the faster it grows. So as populations get bigger, they get bigger faster. So this is our J-shaped population. In theory, given unlimited resources, all populations could grow like this. Of course, that's only in theory. There are limits to the sizes of populations, and we'll get to that in just a second. All right, so what does that look like? I'm going to pull myself out of the way here for a little bit. All right, so this is what we mean by J-shape. It looks like a J, at least this part of it. So initially the growth starts very, very slow. And then you get to this sort of curve here and you hit this tipping point where as the population gets bigger, now it's going to start growing very, very fast. And we have this rapid, steep incline. Notice we're talking about 2 very different organisms here. Here we have bacteria. Here we have elephants. These things, our time is measured in years. Here our time is measured in hours. So very different time scales in which these things grow and reproduce. This one's measuring the growth of bacteria. This one's measuring the growth of elephants. But the point is the same. What we see is this: as populations get bigger, it starts off really slow, but then they reach what they call the tipping point, and then the growth becomes explosive. So as populations get bigger, they get bigger faster. And this is what our reindeer population looked like in our reindeer activity. So it wasn't necessarily this perfectly normal J-shaped, but it was sort of a jagged up and down. But if we did a best fit curved line, it would have looked something like this. And we peaked right at here in our reindeer activity at 2,000 deer on that St. Paul Island. So again, this is population growth left unchecked. That's exponential. The other population growth is called logistic. And this is initially fast. So initially this looks exponential, but then after time, it stabilizes, it slows down and stabilizes and levels off. Most populations follow this pattern. So if a population is new to an area, like if we were to, somehow accidentally import some new insect or some new bird from overseas, initially you would see that exponential growth, that explosive exponential growth, but then it will level off. Now, how long it takes to level off, so this is more of a sort of this S shape as opposed to J shaped. You can see it kind of looks exponential here where it starts slow and then it takes off, but then it stabilizes and it kind of hovers and moves up and down, up and down, up and down with each passing season. Most populations follow this logistic growth pattern. So we have exponential and logistic. And lastly, this is the most, again, a really important concept to come out of this particular page is this right here, carrying capacity. We've already answered this question once on our reindeer activity. We defined it. Let's go over it again, right? Carrying capacity. Oh, by the way, I do want you to, let me backpedal for just a second. I do want you to take a second and just draw this graph. You can just put, time and number of individuals. You don't have to put the little tiny dots, but do create it doesn't have to be, make it neat, but it can be really simple. But I do want you to draw a really simple J-shaped curve, exponential curve, and label that as exponential. That's hence the arrows here. And then draw another graph with time and number of individuals, and then draw the S-shaped graph. You don't need to put in phase 1 or phase 2 or phase 3. We're not gonna expect you to know that. You're not going to be tested on the different phases of logistic growth, but we do expect you to know and understand that it's this growth pattern that starts kind of steep, but then levels off, and that most populations exhibit this kind of growth pattern. All right, now on to carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals of a species that a particular environment can support. And this is really, really important, these last two terms, long term. Think of our reindeer population. The peak number of reindeer on the St. Paul Island in 1938 was 2,000 deer. You might be tempted to say that, oh, that's the carrying capacity. But it is not. That was well beyond the carrying capacity. We know that because the island couldn't support that population size long term. It only did that for literally one season. So again, the carrying capacity is the average number of individuals in a population of a species that a particular environment can support over long term. Now again, if we go back to the logistic growth pattern here, you can see here's the carrying capacity for this population. Note that the population isn't exactly at that carrying capacity. Some seasons it goes higher, some seasons it goes lower. It kind of goes up and down. Right? But there are natural checks and balances that limit the size of this population, that limit it from taking off like that. And that's what we're going to get to next. All right. Almost done. Not too bad. Limits to growth, section 5.2. All of those previous slides were 5.1. What are factors that put downward pressure, that's the phrase I'll sometimes use, or limit the growth of population? All populations are kept in check by limiting factors. And a limiting factor it's anything that controls population growth, anything that limits the size of a population. Limiting factors determine the carrying capacity of any population. Now again, some limiting factors will affect some populations differently than others. We don't need to know specifics, limiting factors specific to particular populations. It's just the recognition that there are limits to how big a population can get, and we call those limits limiting factors. All right, so there are two categories of limiting factors. One is called density dependent, and these are, as the name implies, these are limiting factors that get stronger or weaker as the population gets more crowded or less crowded. So they operate strongly on populations of a certain size, generally bigger populations. Does not affect scattered small populations as well. We'll look at some examples here in just a second to help make sense. So again, two categories of limiting factors. Density dependent, meaning that the limiting factor, the factor that puts downward pressure on the size of a population, gets stronger or more effective as the population gets more dense or more crowded. The other is density independent. These affect all populations equally, regardless of size. It doesn't matter how crowded the population is, whether it's a really crowded population or really small and spread out. It doesn't matter how crowded it is, this factor does not change. And what you can put right over here, like all populations affect the same regardless of size, at the very end of this, just write the word, these are mostly weather related. These are mostly weather related limiting factors. All right, so let's just look at a few of those. All right, so if you need to, take a moment and pause the video and very neatly write out this graphic. And then after you unpause it, I'll take a minute to explain them. All right, so here's our population size. Population size can be limited by our density dependent factors and our density independent factors. Let's just look at these two over here. Basically, they're weather related, like a natural disaster, right? A hurricane, a flood, a volcano, a tornado, a particularly cold winter, a particularly dry summer, right? These are factors that, regardless if the population is big or small, doesn't matter if a population is big or small, wicked cold weather or a flood could kill you either way. Doesn't matter if the population is big or small. How deadly a hurricane is not going to change depending upon the size of the population. So these are factors that are independent of density. Again, think of these mostly as weather related. Most factors that limit populations, the ones that come to mind when you think of them, tend to be the density dependent ones. And if we consider these ones here, this just should make sense to us. Let's take, for instance, the idea of competition. So cheetahs preying on gazelles. If there's more cheetahs in a population, right, that means that the competition among those cheetahs to prey upon the population of gazelles is much higher. It's higher because there's more cheetahs competing for the food source. That would also apply to predation. Think of parasitism and disease. Disease spreads easier when individuals are crowded and close to each other. So as a population gets more crowded, the disease spreads easier. Right now we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? 2020, it's our COVID pandemic, distance learning, hybrid learning. We know that if we're not as crowded, the likelihood of disease spreading isn't as great. Herbivory is just the predation that is done by the herbivores, the plant eaters, and just overcrowding is just the generalized term and how these things can get worse. Right. So the big takeaway here on this slide is there are factors that limit the size of a population. A population cannot just grow and grow and grow and grow and grow without limits. And intuitively, this makes sense to us. We recognize that as a population gets bigger, it's going to start to run out of food. It's going to start to run out of space. Disease could spread. There's going to be more competition among individuals within that population and competition among individuals of different members of different kinds of populations. So that's the big takeaway. That these are things that limit the size of a population. Populations cannot grow forever and ever and ever. Lastly, nothing to write here. Just consider this graphic and just take a look at it for a second. So Isle Royale is a national park. It's right off the coast of, right off the shore of Minnesota. It's in Lake Superior. Technically, it's in Michigan state waters, but it is a national park. On that island are timber wolves and moose, and you can see that this is just a graph that shows the relationship and the interdependence between the wolf and the moose and the predator-prey relationships here. And then as the moose population increases, what lags behind, just a few years behind that, is an increase in the wolf population because more wolves can survive because there's more moose to feed on. As the moose population declines, because the wolf population got too big, then the wolf population would start to decline. In this particular case, this precipitous drop over these couple of years was from a virus outbreak. The point is that we have an intricate relationship between the moose and the wolves, and we have this best fit line that's right around here for the carrying capacity. Now, the number of moose has a different scale than the number of wolves. That's really immaterial. The point is that what we're looking at here is a relationship graphically between predator-prey of competing populations and their approximate carrying capacities. All right, so big takeaway here, 5 factors that describe populations and several factors that limit the size of a population. I hope that was helpful. Supplement your understanding by following up with the reading of 5152 and watching any supplemental videos. Thanks. I hope that helped.